There is a room I keep coming back to. San Diego, 1934. 16 people are sitting in it, and every one of them has been sent there to die, not figuratively. Their own doctors have signed them off. Cancer, most of them, in the stage where the medical language stops being about treatment and starts being about time. And they have been gathered in a clinic on a ranch outside the city, not to be made comfortable, but to be pointed at a machine. A cabinet of tubes and dials built by a man with no medical degree, a man who ground his own lenses and wired his own circuits in a workshop that smelled of solder and dust. Over the weeks that follow, according to the people who were there, most of them walk back out. Not all at once, and not without argument about the numbers ever since, but they walk out, and then something stranger happens than any recovery. The record of what took place in that room is not celebrated, it is not repeated, it is not built upon. It is closed quietly. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. And the man who built the machine spends the rest of his life watching his own name disappear. I did not go looking for Royal Rife. I want to be honest about that, because it changes how you should hear all of this. I was reading about advertising, specifically about how organized medicine in the United States actually made its money in the first half of the 20th century, which turns out to have very little to do with the image we carry of it. In the 1920s and 1930s, the American Medical Association ran one of the most profitable endorsement operations in the country. It had a chemical laboratory and a seal of acceptance, and companies paid handsomely to have their products carry that seal in the pages of the association's journal. The man who ran that journal, and who by most accounts ran the association's public voice for a quarter of a century, was named Morris Fishbein. He was not a practicing physician in any meaningful sense. He had barely treated a patient in his life. He was an editor, a promoter, a gatekeeper, and by the accounts of both his admirers and his enemies, he understood that the authority to say what counted as medicine was worth more than any single treatment. I was following the money through that operation when a footnote sent me sideways into a name I had never heard, attached to a story I assumed had to be exaggerated. It was not until I started pulling the threads apart that I understood why the story makes people so uncomfortable. It is not really a story about a machine. It is a story about what a cure is worth to the people who sell the sickness. So let me tell you who he was first, because the man matters. Rife was born in 1888 inches, Nebraska, and ended up in San Diego, and he was one of those self-taught obsessives that the early 20th century produced and the modern one seems unable to. He had money behind him for a while, patronage from a wealthy family that let him build without begging for grants, and he poured it all into a single question. His obsession was optics. He wanted to see living things that no one had ever seen alive. At the time, the most powerful microscopes in the world hit a wall. To see the smallest organisms, the ones we now call viruses, you had to kill them and stain them and slice them, and a dead thing tells you only so much. The electron microscope, which would eventually let science see that small, had barely been born in a German laboratory and would not be practical for years. Rife wanted to watch these things move, alive, in real time. So over years he built something he called the universal microscope, a monstrous instrument of thousands of parts, one of the largest and most complex light microscopes anyone had ever assembled. The way it worked, or the way he said it worked, is the part that still divides careful people. Instead of staining a specimen with dye, Rife used a system of quartz prisms and intensely polarized light, and he tuned the color of the illumination itself until it matched the frequency of the organism he was hunting. When the light was tuned correctly, he said, the microbe would fluoresce, glowing in its own characteristic color against a black field, revealing itself without being killed. The magnifications claimed for the instrument were staggering, many times beyond what the physics of ordinary visible light was supposed to permit, and this is exactly the point where the modern skeptic plants a flag and refuses to move. We will come back to that flag, because it deserves to be planted. But hold on to this first. People who looked through that instrument were not all fools and followers. Some were trained scientists who arrived expecting to leave unimpressed, and who instead described watching living organisms that no stain had ever shown them. And there is a bitter irony buried in the timeline that the skeptics rarely pause on. Rife's entire complaint was that the science of his day could only study these organisms by killing them first. Within a decade or two, the electron microscope proved him at least half right, because it could finally reveal things far smaller than visible light should ever allow, and yet it too could only show them dead, frozen, coated and sliced, never alive and never moving. The one thing Rife swore his instrument could do, watch a living microbe change its shape and then die in real time, remains difficult even now. So the machine sits in a strange position. It was either an impossible fraud that fooled trained observers, or it was a solution to a problem that mainstream science would go on struggling with for the next half-century. There is not much comfortable middle ground between those two readings, and that discomfort is a large part of the reason this story simply will not lie down and stay buried. Here is where the idea gets dangerous, in the sense that dangerous ideas are the ones that threaten an arrangement. Rife believed that every living microorganism has a frequency at which it naturally vibrates, and he believed that if you could find that exact frequency and then drive it hard enough with a matching signal, you could shatter the organism the way a trained voice can shatter a wine glass. The glass does not break because the singer is loud. It breaks because the note is exactly right and the glass cannot stop itself from answering. Rife called the killing frequency for each microbe its mortal oscillatory rate. He built a device to broadcast those frequencies, a gas-filled tube that pulsed the signal into the room and, he claimed, into the tissue of a living patient, destroying the target organism while leaving the surrounding cells untouched because they answered to a different note. He believed he had found the rates for a long list of afflictions, the organisms behind typhoid and herpes and other diseases of his day. And then he made the claim that turned a curiosity into a threat. He said he had found the organism responsible for cancer itself, a tiny form he labelled BX, which he insisted he had watched change shape under his lens, transforming from one kind of microbe into another, and which he claimed he could kill with its own particular frequency without harming the body around it. That claim, that a microbe could change its very form, was not a small thing to say in 1934. It struck at the settled doctrine of the era, the belief that each germ was a fixed and separate species that bred true and never became anything else. Rife's collaborator, a respected bacteriologist from Northwestern University named Arthur Kendall, had staked his own reputation on a related idea, that ordinary bacteria could pass through a tiny, filterable stage, a form small enough and strange enough that only an instrument like Rife's could catch it. When Kendall and Rife demonstrated this together, they were not merely showing off a gadget. They were challenging the foundation of how medicine understood disease, an old argument that reached all the way back to the founding quarrels of germ theory about whether the germ or the terrain of the body was the true cause of illness. To the guardians of orthodoxy, this was not exciting. It was heresy, and heretics who are also right are the most expensive kind. For a while, though, he was not a crank in a garage. He was a man the serious people took seriously. A wealthy and respected Los Angeles physician named Milbank Johnson, who had been a professor and who moved easily among the medical elite of Southern California, became his patron and his shield. Kendall staked his standing on what the microscope revealed. And in one striking episode from 1931, a physician from the Mayo Clinic Foundation named Edward Rosenau traveled to California, looked through the instrument himself, and came away sufficiently convinced to co-author observations about the strange, filterable forms it showed. Think about what that means. This was not a fringe operation begging for scraps of attention. Men from the most prestigious institution in American medicine were making the trip to San Diego to look. In November of 1931, Johnson hosted a formal dinner in Rife's honor. More than 40 physicians and researchers attended. The banner over the evening, by the accounts that survive, announced the end to all diseases. Read that again and sit with how confident these men were. These were not desperate people clutching at a miracle. These were established figures who had looked through the instrument, watched the demonstrations, and concluded that something real and enormous was happening in that workshop. That is the part the debunking version always skips. The men who believed Rife had the most to lose by believing him, and they believed him anyway. Which brings us to the room. In 1934, a clinic was arranged, by the accounts of Rife's circle, under the oversight of a special medical research committee connected to the University of Southern California, with Johnson organizing and other physicians observing. 16 patients diagnosed as terminal, most with advanced cancer, were brought to a facility on Scripps Ranch north of the city. They were treated with Rife's frequency device on a schedule spread over a period of roughly 3 months. The observers, as the story is told, would examine each patient, watch the treatment, and track the change. And at the end of it, the committee's finding, as reported by those present, was that after 90 days the great majority were declared clinically recovered, and after adjustments to the treatment schedule the remainder followed. 14 of 16, then all 16. That is the number that has echoed for 90 years. That is the claim in the title of every video and book that has ever been made about this man. Terminal cases, sent home to die, walking out of a clinic because a machine tuned to a frequency did what surgery and radiation could not. Now I have to slow down and be the honest narrator here, because if I just hand you that number and move on, I'm doing the same thing I accuse the other side of doing. The trouble with the 1,934 clinic is that the documentation we have comes overwhelmingly from Rife's own supporters, compiled and retold long after the fact, most famously in a book written decades later by an advocate named Barry Lyons, whose title simply declared that the cancer cure had worked. The original committee report in full, the raw case files, the independent confirmation from a hostile party who wanted Rife to fail, these are the things that would turn the claim into settled history, and they are exactly the things that are thin, missing, or contested. Some of the physicians named in the accounts later distanced themselves or gave versions that do not line up cleanly with the triumphant retelling. So when you hear 14 of 16, hold it the way an honest person holds any extraordinary claim without a full paper trail. It might have happened close to the way they said. It might have been a smaller, messier, partial result that grew rounder and cleaner every time it was told. The point of this film is not to force you to swallow the number. The point is what happened to the question itself. Because whatever occurred in that room, the response of the institutions that should have wanted to know was not to test it harder in the open, it was to make sure it was never seriously tested again. That is where Fishbein re-enters the story, and where the accounts of Rife's decline all converge on a single shape even when they disagree on the details. To understand the man, you have to understand that Fishbein had a documented history of destroying people who offered cancer treatments outside his approval. His long and public war with Harry Hoxsey, a former coal miner who ran herbal cancer clinics, is a matter of open record. Fishbein branded him a quack in print for years. Hoxsey sued him for libel. And remarkably, in the 1940s, a court actually found in Hoxsey's favour on key points, a rare and humiliating loss for the most powerful voice in American medicine. This is the man we are dealing with, not a careful scientist weighing evidence, but a promoter and enforcer who understood that his authority depended on no one being allowed to cure anything without his blessing. The version of Rife's fall told by his defenders is direct. Fishbein, or interests aligned with him, approached Rife, or the company forming around his device, and sought to buy control of it. And when the terms were refused, when Rife would not surrender the rights on the terms offered, the full weight of organized medicine turned against him. Journals that might have published were closed to him. Physicians who used or endorsed the device found their standing quietly threatened. Kendall's reputation was picked apart by defenders of orthodoxy, including powerful figures at the great research institutes who insisted the filterable forms simply could not exist. Johnson, the patron who could open any door in Southern California, died in 1944, and to this day some of Rife's followers insist he was poisoned to silence him, though the ordinary and far more likely explanation is simply that an old man died of old age. I cannot prove the buyout offer to you. What I can tell you is that the pattern of a powerful gatekeeper crushing an unaffiliated challenger is not exotic in the history of American medicine. It is close to routine, and Fishbein wrote the manual. A man like that does not need a shadowy conspiracy to end you. He needs only to decide that you are bad for business, and to hold the authority to make that opinion sound like the verdict of science itself. The end came in pieces, the way these things usually do, rather than in one dramatic blow. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. A company had formed to manufacture the device called Beam Ray, and in 1939 it tore itself apart in a lawsuit, one of the partners, an engineer named Philip Hoyland, turning against the others in a fight over money and control that had nothing to do with physics and everything to do with human greed. Rife was dragged into the witness box. By the accounts of that period, he had already begun drinking heavily, the pressure and the disappointment eating at him, and the courtroom did him no favours. The company did not survive the fight. Equipment was scattered and sold off. Records were lost. And in the lore of this story, a laboratory fire on the other side of the country, at facilities in New Jersey where related work was underway, destroyed instruments and documentation that might otherwise have preserved the proof. Whether that fire was sabotage or simple bad luck is another thing no one can hand you clean, but the cumulative effect was the same. Piece by piece, the physical evidence that this man had ever done anything remarkable was broken, burned, filed away, or left to corrode in storage. The demonstrations stopped. The believers scattered or fell silent or grew afraid, and the machine that 16 dying people supposedly walked away from became a rumour, then a legend, then a punchline. Rife himself lived until 1971. That is the detail that always stops me cold. He did not die young and mysterious in the year of his trouble. He lived on for more than 30 years, into a completely changed world, an old man in San Diego, largely forgotten, drinking, giving the occasional interview to whoever still believed him, watching from a great distance as cancer became one of the defining and most profitable industries of the modern age. In the 1950s he tried again, quietly, working with a younger associate named John Crane to rebuild and sell the devices, and even that ended the way everything else did. Crane was prosecuted and convicted in the early 1960s for selling the frequency instruments, and the machines were seized. The state itself had now moved against the thing. Rife died in a hospital, by most accounts with alcohol and a sedative in his system, a broken and bitter man who was certain until the end that he had been robbed of his place in history. You are free to think he was a fraud who slowly convinced himself. You are free to think he was a genius the system could not afford to acknowledge. But you cannot look at those 30 years of grinding, structured erasure, and honestly call them an accident of neglect. Neglect does not require a lawsuit, a hostile journal, a criminal prosecution, and a burned laboratory. Neglect just forgets you. What happened to Royal Rife had architecture. Here is what should have been the end of it, and was not. For more than a decade after Rife died, his name belonged only to a handful of aging believers and the occasional curious researcher poking through old files. Then, in 1987, an advocate named Barry Lines published a book that told the whole saga as a suppressed miracle, and it landed like a lit match on dry grass. The timing was perfect. A generation was growing deeply suspicious of its institutions, and here was a story that seemed to confirm the darkest suspicion of all, that a real cure for cancer had once existed and had been strangled in its cradle for the sake of money. When the internet arrived, the story found its permanent home. It became one of those legends that can never be fully killed and never be fully proven, passed hand to hand in forums and videos, growing more certain and more detailed with every retelling, even as the original evidence grew no stronger. And into that hunger stepped the sellers. An entire industry of frequency generators marketed with Rife's name spread across the world, sold to frightened and desperate people at frightening prices. In 2009, a man named James Folsom was convicted in a United States federal court on dozens of counts for selling these devices under a rotating set of company names. That is the shape of the afterlife. A genuine historical mystery sitting at the center, and a ring of profiteers feeding on it at the edges, each one making the mystery harder for any serious person to take seriously again. Let me give the skeptics their full say now, because they deserve it, and because a story like this one rots from the inside without it. The mainstream case against Rife is not stupid, and anyone who pretends it is should not be trusted. It runs like this. His microscope's most extreme magnification claims sit in genuine tension with the known physics of visible light, and no working instrument built to his exact surviving specifications has been independently reproduced and verified doing what he said it did. The cancer microbe he called BX has never been confirmed by any independent laboratory. The changing, filterable bacterial forms that Kendall championed were rejected by mainstream bacteriology and are not accepted today. And here is the most important part for anyone watching this in the present tense. The modern devices sold under Rife's name, the so-called Rife machines you can still buy right now with a search and a credit card, have been examined and shown to produce frequencies that do not remotely match his own published figures, which means the entire modern industry is built on a dead man's name, not on his method, and that industry has a real body count. People with genuinely treatable cancers have abandoned real treatment for a box of dials and blinking lights and died of diseases that medicine could have managed or beaten. There have been criminal fraud prosecutions of the sellers on more than one continent. There have been formal warnings from health regulators in country after country. If you take one practical thing from this entire film, take this. Whatever Royal Rife did or did not do in that room in 1934, the machine with his name stamped on it that a salesman wants to sell you today is almost certainly not that. And betting your life on it against the honest advice of an oncologist is exactly how this story turns from a mystery into a funeral. I am not telling you to distrust your doctor. I am telling you to distrust anyone who profits from your fear, and that warning cuts in every direction at once. Because here is the thing the skeptics never quite finish saying. They can explain the microscope, they can explain the missing BX virus, they can explain the fraudulent modern devices with real ease. What they explain far less comfortably is the behavior of the institutions at the time. If Rife was simply a deluded man with an instrument that did not work, the response of science is easy and obvious and clean. You test it, you fail to replicate it, you publish the failure with your name on it, and you move on with your reputation intact for having done the honest work. That is how a bad claim is supposed to die, in the open, with a cause of death written down that anyone can check. That is not what happened here. What happened here was pressure, and a partnership blown apart by a lawsuit and lost records, and a laboratory fire, and a criminal conviction, and a gatekeeper who, by his own era's public record, was more interested in who controlled a treatment than in whether the treatment worked. You do not need to break a man across 3 decades to disprove something. You break a man like that, or benefit quietly from his breaking, when you are afraid of what happens if the thing he built gets tested fairly by someone you cannot buy and cannot silence. And that is finally the part that pulled me out of the advertising history and into this story for good. Follow the economics, because the economics are the only part of this whole affair that leave no room for argument at all. Think honestly for 1 full minute about what a true cure is, considered purely as a financial object. A cure is a single transaction. You have the disease, you receive the cure, the disease is gone, and the commercial relationship ends there forever. Now think about what a treatment is by comparison. A treatment is a subscription. It manages the disease without ending it. It requires the next appointment, the next dose, the next scan, the next refill, month after month, year after year, sometimes for the whole remainder of a human life. One of those two things builds an industry that can employ millions and fund skyscrapers and buy the advertising that fills the journals. The other one quietly ends that industry. And every institution that grows up around a persistent disease, the manufacturers, the specialists, the journals that carry their advertising, the entire delicate and enormous economy of the incurable, carries a permanent and mostly invisible interest in the answer being management rather than cure. No one has to send a memo. No one has to sit in a dark panelled room and plot against humanity over cigars. The incentive does the work all by itself, silently, structurally, the way water finds the low ground without being told where it is. A device that cures a disease in 90 days and then sits idle in a closet is not a business model. It is a threat to every business that has carefully arranged itself around that disease, staying exactly as permanent and as expensive as it currently is. And this is where a story about one man and one machine opens onto something much larger, the thing I spend most of my time thinking about. Every era inherits its picture of what is possible from the institutions that curate the record of the era before it. We are taught, gently and constantly, that history is a slope, that we happen to stand at the very top of it, that the people who came before us were simpler and knew less, and that whatever they managed to do, we can surely do better. But a record is not the same thing as the truth. A record is a set of choices about what to keep and what to file, what to celebrate and what to quietly leave out of the textbook, what to preserve in a display case, and what to lose in a basement. Control the record and you control not only the past, but the sense of what the future is even allowed to contain. Rife is a small and sharp example of a pattern that turns up everywhere once you have learned to see the shape of it. A capability appears. It threatens an existing arrangement, and within a single generation it is not so much disproven as it is simply unremembered, filed and forgotten, until the very people it might have saved no longer even know that there was once a question worth asking. That is the real reason I think this story refuses to die, 90 years after a room in San Diego emptied out, long after every single person who was in it has turned to dust. It is not really about whether a beam of a certain frequency can shatter a microbe the way a soprano's note shatters crystal. It is about the moment a society handed the authority to decide what counts as legitimate medicine to the very same people who profit from what medicine sells, and then trusted those people to tell us honestly whenever something arrived that would cost them everything they had built. Rife may have been wrong. His microscope may have shown him beautiful things that were not truly there. His 16 patients may be a number that swelled and rounded in 40 years of retelling. I hold every bit of that as possible, and I will not pretend to you that I know otherwise. But the question of whether he was right was taken away from all of us before it could ever be fairly answered, and it was not taken away by patient scientists failing to replicate a result. It was taken away by men who understood, consciously or not, that some questions are simply more profitable when they are never allowed to be asked. So I will leave you where the record itself leaves me, which is not with a verdict but with a discomfort I have not been able to put back down since the footnote first sent me sideways. Somewhere out there, in a private collection or a forgotten storage unit or a cardboard box of papers that no heir ever bothered to read, some fragment of what actually happened on that ranch in 1934 may still exist, waiting. And the strangest thing about this entire story is not that a self-taught man in a dusty workshop might have stumbled onto something enormous. Stranger things have happened at the edges of science. The strangest thing is how much deliberate effort went into making certain that the rest of us would never be allowed to look at what he found and judge it for ourselves. Machines can be rebuilt from specifications. Frequencies can be measured again in any competent laboratory. 16 old case files can be reopened by anyone with the will and the funding to reopen them. The only thing in this whole story that truly cannot be recovered is the willingness to ask the question in the first place, and that is precisely the one thing we have watched being deliberately, patiently, and successfully destroyed across the better part of a century. The archives do not forget. They only wait for someone who wants the answer more badly than the men who buried it wanted the silence. Make of that what you will.